Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Takshishila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst at the Geostrategy program, and I have with me today my colleague Abhishek Kadiyala, also from the Geostrategy program. Today we're going to be discussing the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting that took place on Tuesday, 26th May. We're recording this podcast right after the meeting. The joint statement and fact sheet are still not out, so we don't have details, but let's look at what's been achieved so far and all the news coming in. So the Quad meeting just happened in Delhi. There was External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Australian FM Penny Wong, and Japanese Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi. And this comes at a very interesting time, right? For the longest time, there was so much uncertainty about the Quad because we didn't have the Leader Summit last year and India is the host. So I think this meeting does show that Quad remains somewhat a core priority for all these four nations. And I think we can start with looking at what was discussed, right? I think maritime security was really at the center stage, given the upheaval that we've seen in global trade this year in light of the West Asian War. There is Indo-Pacific Maritime Surveillance Cooperation Initiative, Abhishek, that's been launched. It's a framework, I think, to integrate maritime surveillance capabilities of all nations. We saw an expansion of the existing IPMDA initiative, the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness, the Quad at Sea mission, which is an exercise between the coast guards of all four nations, is likely going to happen sometime soon. There was a bilateral agreement between India and the US. There was also an Indo-Pacific Energy Security Framework. I think this is extremely new, and it's not surprising, given the concerns of the potential disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. It's high time that Quad also works together on an emergency response to fuel and energy supply chain shocks. So Abhishek, help us put this into perspective. How does this align with the broader Quad agenda? What were the expectations before going into this meeting? What have we achieved after it? Let's discuss that.
Yes, thank you so much, Vanshika, for joining me. If we look at the context in which this meeting took place, it was obviously after the very interesting meeting that took place between Xi and Trump, right? If you look at it from that context, one thing that was agreed in this particular meeting was that there would be competition between US and China, but that would be constructive and that would focus on the larger strategic goals of both the countries. So looking at it from that particular lens, when we look at the agenda points coming into this particular meeting, the broader focus was on China. But if we look at all the agenda points discussed, we can also see that the focus has shifted from a more security oriented or strategic perspective, as we had seen during the Biden era, to a more, say, economic security, supply line, supply chain oriented, critical mineral oriented frameworks that we are seeing today. And this shift is part of how US is positioning Quad partners as part of its competition with China. So the competition aspect still exists, and that is where the new role of the Quad, emerges. And this is US is signaling the major agenda setting of this particular conference. Is US is signaling to hint that it has a new role for Quad. It has not entirely forgotten Quad as it was alleged after the first year of the second Trump administration. And this new role involves greater economic cooperation between these partners, and not only economic cooperation, but also active measures to somewhere restrict China's growing economic influence over not only the partners in the Quad, but also the region as a whole. Right. So this is what we can clearly see. And obviously, as you very rightly mentioned, the new Indo-Pacific Maritime Surveillance Initiative, that somewhere reaffirms this as well, right? Because one of the major allegations against Chinese has been their dual use, maritime component that has been, seen as a threat for different countries going forward, especially in deep waters, especially in relation to security of things like as basic as supply chains and as complex as undersea cables and things like that. So. It is an active measure to counter this threat, and this has been in works for years because maritime security has been very central to and the broader freedom of navigation to use seas. This angle has been very active in relation to the Quad's broader agenda. So this is in many ways can be considered a welcome change. Another important outcome out of this particular conference has been the broader stance the Quad partners took in relation to not Iran war per se, or the conflict going on in West Asia per se, but on the energy crisis that has come out of it and the broader role of Strait of Hormuz, right? Because one common consensus that all the partners, irrespective of their alignments in this conflict, has come out with is that all of them are openly opposing the tokenization or the toll boothing system that Iranians have expressed to put in place in the years going forward. And this is not only in relation to energy security, but there were reports that these plans are also being extended to the deep sea cables of the internet. So that is also another important component that the Quad has come out in opposition to, although not explicitly energy or deep sea cables, but a broader opposition to the tolling system that Iran plans to impose on Strait of Hormuz. This is in relation to, again, stating that 3 out of the 4 partners of Quad are extensively reliant on Strait of Hormuz, imports, especially in the energy field. So that is clearly reflected here, right? So speaking of maritime security, China and especially energy reliance, obviously we all know how much a country like Australia or Japan are dependent on, this particular component, and the broader and how close this agenda has been to these both countries. So as someone who has been very closely following these two Quad partners, what are your thoughts? Let's start with Australia on how this summit has been for them so far.
Right. So I think, as you mentioned, for Canberra, the Quad is a very region focused platform. And one thing that they always want to do is reassure Southeast Asia, Pacific, that look, Quad is not something that's an anti-China sort of coalition at all. And in general, in broadly, Quad also fits with Australia's other frameworks, right? Especially AUKUS, its engagement with the Pacific and ASEAN. But I think the biggest takeaway is that Australia has long feared about the security vacuum in the Pacific that could allow Beijing to sort of establish a more military foothold in the region. We saw that with increasing police training, and that really put off both US and Australia. But in this meeting, there was a discussion on establishing port infrastructure in Fiji, which I think is one of the biggest wins for Australia, because we had this Ports of the Future project launched by Quad. And so we see here that Australia has successfully leveraged that part of Quad's collective sort of financial and diplomatic muscle to provide an infrastructure alternative to these Pacific Island nations, an alternative to China's BRI and China's expanding sort of infrastructure, projects there. So I think in that term, in that ways, it's a big win. This would also be the first time that the four partners would be working together on a port development project. Secondly, as you mentioned, Australia is again very highly dependent on open sea lanes for its vast exports. Australia is a very high export commodity based nation. Its economy depends heavily on it. It's not like India, which has a big domestic base and can survive, economic shocks of that sort of magnitude. So I think this maritime surveillance cooperation initiative also gives Australia much needed, real time intelligence in both the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. Yeah, and the third would be obviously, critical minerals. Given Australia has a large sort of resource base, Quad is an opportunity to sort of become a trusted supplier for India, for Japan, for US. So yeah, I think for Australia, as usual, the biggest challenge is managing that very deep economic relationship that they have with China on the one hand, and on the other, their relationship with the Quad nations. And I think the biggest advantage that Australia has definitely is its geography and its ability to connect both the Indian and the Pacific Ocean theaters, which are as we saw, the main focus area of the Quad.
So again, as we mentioned, Australia is one important piece in this, and then we also have Japan. Japan has sort of rejuvenated itself in the past couple of years, especially since the Trump administration had come in. A lot of changes within Japan domestically. So in that context, how does Japan see this particular meeting and the broader achievements that have come out of it?
Yeah, I think Tokyo is viewing Quad with even greater urgency than before. And I think one of the reasons for that is its recent sort of escalation spiral with China. Since Japan has started sort of evolving its own security posture, it's increased its counter-strike capabilities, and that's really been a concern for China. And in response, China has used a lot of economic coercion tools like export controls on very specific small components of semiconductors, critical minerals. So I think for Japan, increasingly, this focus on economic security, on supply chain resilience, and the concern of Chinese restrictions on critical materials, I think really increases Japan's interest in Quad. And second, obviously, Japan has traditionally relied very heavily on its alliance with the United States, but that reliability itself is now being questioned. So I think Quad has provided that sort of platform for Japan to also increase its collaboration with India and Australia in terms of Indo-Pacific security. And I think the second important thing, takeaway for Japan is also the recent energy security framework that I mentioned, because Japan, like India, imports nearly all of its oil and gas. So this any disruption in global shipping will be a massive threat to its economy. So I think trying to seek some sort of coordinated multinational safeguard to protect energy corridors against these sort of blockades that we discussed for Japan again is extremely important. But talking about Japan, Quad for the longest time has been extremely, in certain ways, over reliant on the United States and its own direction that it provides to the platform. And Abhishek, you touched initially on how the US is now managing its constructive competition, strategic competition with China. So just on that context, there were a lot of questions on US's commitment to the Quad, given we didn't see any leader level summit, and questions about it. But over the last few months, there was increasingly a view that US institutions, which had already sort of internalized China as a long term challenge, they somehow kept the Quad alive, right? So, how important were the role of these institutions, whether the Congress, whether the state, or I don't know, the Indo-Pac Command? How did they keep the Quad alive?
So, when we look at US and US institutions in particular, the broader rhetoric has been that Trump has been, downgrading the role of Quad since his, second term. And one of the primary arguments that has been made in this regard was obviously that Trump did not attend or give adequate time to, the Quad Leaders Summit. This was also in the context of the ongoing tariff war and, related negotiations. But Apart from that, one major thing that Trump very importantly did was that under Biden administration, the Quad became transformed itself from a cooperation focused, framework to a leadership driven platform, as very rightfully put by Dhruva Jaishankar in his congressional hearing. And under Trump administration, though, this leadership driven focus with the US especially has been downgraded because Quad was expanded into several working groups focusing on several important domains of cooperation within the broader framework. And under Trump, the scope of these working groups have been scaled back. The number of working groups have come down drastically, and that has resulted in a change in rhetoric in relation to Quad and growing insecurity in the context of the relationship as well. And another important point was also that again the under the second Trump administration, the US relationship with China was also pretty weird, where they had to focus on economic competition more than say aggressive strategic posturing, or this also involved supporting the partners or allies in that sense, right? And there were also multiple threats by different members of the administration. Trump himself calling like especially countries that are dependent on US troop deployments like Japan. There were calls that US would pull their troops out of these countries, and that kind of thing. So this put the Quad in a broader set of uncertainty, as you rightly put forward, that US plays this kind of central role in bringing Quad together, and without it, it would be tough. And this is where the US institutions step in, right? Because under the Quad thing, there has been a growing focus within the US Congress on the Quad, as seen most importantly in National Defense Authorization Bill, for which was placed last year and continues. And as will be implemented this year. So it calls for Quad partners to be positioned as part of a security cooperation initiative, and most importantly pitches them as key players in the defense manufacturing realm, which US is planning to expand to its partner states, and especially in terms of space and critical technology as well. There is Quad Economic Security Act, which further advances this agenda, which calls for greater cooperation within Quad partners and the US. In if for broader economic security, that also includes critical technology and things like space, right? And this is also very important in the context of the growing capabilities of these sectors in the past couple of years. So that is another important component when we look at this. Apart from that, there is obviously Quad Investors Network, on which US has laid heavy emphasis on, especially through the Congress and congressional legislation, and where US has also granted extensive funds and continued their funding to Quad Investors Network, where they aim to expand cooperation not only at the levels of governments and at the top levels, but at the very grassroots levels of individual innovators, startups, and broader private sector cooperation in this realm, right? So, and this is focused especially on critical technologies, especially in sectors such as space and critical minerals and semiconductor manufacturing and things like that. So these emerge as very important anchors, as the saying goes, wherever the money goes, there goes the influence. These initiatives, this support, legislative support by US Congress, that directs the US money into these channels, has kept Quad alive throughout this period of uncertainty. And if you look at today's the summit and its broader agenda, all of this have been very carefully driven by the US congressional legislation as well. Because if we look at the deals that have been achieved on critical minerals, be it the US India bilateral deal or the broader Quad framework that focuses on critical minerals, that has its roots in this congressional legislation. And we also obviously have the Quad Economic Security Act, which also is heavily emphasized, be it freedom of navigation, maritime security, supply line security, and things like that. All of them have been very strongly put forth and supported by the US congressional process, which has percolated its way down into the meeting we are seeing today, right? And that is the major achievement of these institutions.
Right. Now, we'll just quickly come to India for a bit. What does New Delhi want from Quad at this stage? We were hosts this year and we've always been careful not to, present Quad as some sort of formal alliance. So, what are our domestic priorities when it comes to Quad?
So before this meeting took place, one of the primary we obviously believed that economic cooperation, economic security, maritime security will be obviously key. We also India also had special emphasis on issues such as disaster relief and that kind, right? Cooperation in information sharing and all of that. Partially that has been achieved, especially in terms of information sharing. We have achieved a framework for that. But one major important, rather symbolic focus of India as part of Quad was the Quad Leaders Summit. Now, today, that Leaders Summit is still, under the realm of uncertainty, because there have been reports that India is planning to pass on the baton to Australia now, and the Quad Leaders Summit, whenever it will take place, if at all it will take place in the future, will take place in Australia directly. And there will be no prospects of President Donald Trump coming to India as part of this. So that can be considered an important point. I wouldn't categorize it as a win or a loss for India, but that is definitely an important point that India should consider politically and symbolically in that manner. Now, another important point, as you had very rightly mentioned, the Fiji project. I think that should give India an understanding of the broader economic security aspect of it, right? Because with the Fiji project, obviously Fiji has the potential to be developed into a major transshipment hub for countries in the region, and would give Quad partners, especially Australia and India, a greater access to the sea lanes pathways if and when this project is very successfully executed. And India also has that kind of opportunities, be it our domestic ports in the southern tip, or be it prospects of our plans in relation to the Greater Nicobar project. India has that kind of opportunity of creating an impact on sea lanes. And if we look at it as a project for economic security, and I think Quad would provide a great opportunity for that. And going forward, India has a greater scope to push for greater Quad cooperation on such projects as well. Obviously, there will be arguments discussing that India might not want to risk its strategic autonomy in that sense. But economically, this is definitely a sound plan going forward. Lastly, coming to the energy aspect of it, I think obviously our energy cooperation framework in terms of things like petroleum would be very important, because one can import them directly from countries like the US. But India's unique energy challenges, especially in relation to Strait of Hormuz, comes from our LPG gas supplies and things like that, right? And for that, the infrastructure which India has domestically needs to be upgraded, and that has been actually a core component of the Quad agenda since the start. That critical infrastructure also needs to be focused on and invested upon. So I think going forward, this can also emerge as an issue, but it is very important that India has taken a stance on opposing the tolling of the key Strait of Hormuz, or the sea lanes that pass under it. So that is one important development in relation to India, is what I feel.
Right. Thank you, Abhishek. For all our listeners and those especially interested in US domestic politics and foreign policy, I encourage them to read Abhishek's Substack called DC Dossier, where he tracks developments across the US Congress. Thank you so much, Abhishek.
Thank you, Vanshika. And for those who are looking to, focus on, be it Australia, be it Japan, or be it any of the India's East Asia partners, if you want to constantly track them, know more about them, do check out Vanshika's India Radius on Substack. The links to both of our platforms are pasted below. And we have also launched a congressional tracker tracking the midterms, as we had discussed how institutions such as US Congress play a major role in focusing and orienting and directing US foreign policy, especially in relation to India and Quad. it is important that we keep a track of such institutions. And one important way you can do that is by following our US midterm racebook, links to which again are posted in the description below. So thank you so much everyone for joining us, and keep tuning into All Things Policy podcast. See you around.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.